Well, today is January the 3rd and Christmas is over. Christmas actually was over before it ever began because I was in Dollar General in Fallston before Christmas and they already were taking up their Christmas stuff, putting out their Valentine's stuff. So Christmas was actually over before it began. But actually, within Christianity, this is still Christmas time. Within Christianity, Christmas time lasts until January the 6th. And I wanted to talk some about that today and talk about a few miscellaneous things around Christmas and around the year at home. Now, if you'll remember, back in December, we had 4 Sundays of Advent, and that was a time of preparation for the coming of Jesus. Then, of course, on December 25th was Christmas Day. And the season of Christmas itself in Christianity lasts 12 days until it ends on January the 6th on what's called Epiphany. Now, the word Epiphany means a sudden insight or understanding, and it means the manifestation of a divine being. In Christianity, Epiphany is seen as the time when Jesus was recognized for what he was, and this was seen as happening when the Magi visited the baby Jesus. Remember, the Magi saw a star and they followed it, and they eventually got to Bethlehem where they saw the baby Jesus, and they gave him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And that is seen as when Jesus was officially recognized for who he was. And since the Bible tells us the Magi came from afar off, it doesn't tell us exactly where they came from, only that they came from afar off. Traditionally in Christianity, it was seen as taking 12 days for them to follow the star and get to Bethlehem. And that's why Epiphany is 12 days after Christmas. So in Christianity, Christmas per se begins on December the 25th, and it lasts for 12 days until January the 6th. That's why all these Christmas decorations are still up in here. It's technically still Christmas. It may not be outside, but it is in here. Now, in the ancient world, and in even some parts of the world today, it was customary to give your Christmas presents on January the 6th. The date of Epiphany, because that's when the Magi gave the gifts to the baby Jesus. In fact, in some parts of the world today, it's customary to give gifts on every day of the 12 days of Christmas. And it used to be back in the old times too. And that's where the Christmas song, the 12 Days of Christmas, comes from. Remember in that song, somebody gets a gift on each of the 12 days of Christmas. Now, if you've noticed, for the past 6 weeks, we've had this wreath up here. That's called an Advent wreath. And you'll notice that there's one big candle in the middle, and there are 4 other candles that are smaller. Now, each one of the small candles represents one of the Sundays of Advent. And if you noticed when you came in during Advent, you noticed that on the first Sunday, 1 candle was lighted, the second 2, the third 3, and so on. And then last Sunday, if you were here, you'll notice that all 4 was lighted, and so was the middle candle. Now, the middle candle is lighted on Christmas. And so what it symbolizes is Jesus. That is the Christ candle. The middle candle is symbolizing Jesus. Now, it is lighted on last Sunday and today in conjunction with the Advent wreath, because the lighting of that candle signals that the candles for the Advent wreath have been fulfilled with the coming of Jesus. Now, that big candle that's in the Advent wreath, you may have noticed that normally it used to sit on a stand over there. And remember, that is the Christ candle. And the reason it sits on the stand over there and is lit on all the other Sundays of the year is that that symbolizes Jesus as the light of the world. Remember, Jesus said he is the light of the world. And the Gospel of John calls Jesus the light that shines in the darkness. And so next Sunday, that candle will be back over here. It symbolizes Jesus as the light of the world. Why, though, is all this surrounded by a wreath up here? And then if you'll notice next Sunday and the Sundays before Advent, when the Christ candle used to sit up here, you'll notice that it was also surrounded by a wreath. Well, the reason a wreath surrounds that is because a wreath symbolizes victory. And that symbolizes Jesus as the victor. So that's the symbolism of that Advent wreath. It is also the symbolism of the Christ candle. It is to remind us that Jesus is the light of the world. Now you may have noticed that every Sunday we have an open Bible back here on this table. And that's not just there for decoration. The open Bible signifies that in Christianity, the Bible is the ultimate authority. The Bible is the only infallible guide to faith and life. And every Christian belief must be attested to in some way or another in the Bible. Now, of course, what the Bible says has to be interpreted, and people interpret it in different ways, and often contradictory ways, and that's why there's so many different and contradictory beliefs in Christianity. People interpret that Bible differently, but still, every belief has to be attested to in some way in that Bible. It has to come from an interpretation. We may not agree with their interpretation, but it has to come from there some way. In Christianity, we cannot just pull beliefs out of thin air. We have to be able to go back to the Bible there and show support for our beliefs one way or another. It doesn't matter what's current in society today. It doesn't matter what the trends of society are. It does not matter what science says. It does not matter what the government says. It doesn't matter what any group of Christians say. It doesn't matter what any denominational assembly says, what any denominational group of officials says. It doesn't matter what any preacher says. We always go back to the Bible. That is the ultimate authority. And that is what that open Bible is there to remind us of. It is the ultimate authority in Christianity. Now, in Christianity, the Bible is said to be complete. And that is that the belief in Christianity is that nothing will ever come that will add to or take away from the Bible. Now, sometimes there is a notion, and I've even seen billboards that say this. Sometimes there is a notion that people get that the Bible contains the answers to all questions. I've seen that on billboards. However, traditionally, Christianity has never said that. Christianity has never said the Bible has the answers to all questions. What Christianity has said is that the Bible contains all things necessary for our salvation. It contains all things necessary for our salvation. Now that table back there that the Bible sits on is technically known as a reredos. R-E-R-E-D-O-S. Most of you know that this building was originally built as the Episcopal Church, and it originally stood on the corner of Lafayette and Grand Streets. The pews in this building are hand-sawed pews that were made here. They are original to this building. And this reredos up here is also original to this building. In an Episcopal service, and remember this was originally Episcopal church, there would have been an altar, a smaller table, sitting in front of that big one, and that's where the communion bread and wine would have been, and that's where communion would have been performed. in this church originally during communion, people would have come up here and they would have knelt up here at this railing. There would have been cushions on the floor. They would have knelt at that railing and they would have received communion from the inside out, kneeling at that railing. And there would have also been some sort of mechanism to slide through here to make a railing in the middle too. Now, a reredos, which is this big table, is simply a table or screen that sits behind the altar. If you've ever been in some of the big, more elaborate Catholic churches, you may have noticed that they're more than just a table. It may be a huge screen thing standing up, and it may have painting on it and various kinds of decorations on it. It may even have little niches in it where they have statues in it. But this is just a simple arrangement. Traditionally, in Episcopal churches, they are more simple. Now, traditionally, in a simple arrangement like this, there are flowers on the reredos table, and we have them on ours too. You'll notice there are 2 candles up here. We do not use real candles here because the owners of this building prohibit flame because this building is so old. But Wanda found these candles, and they do look surprisingly like real candles from far off. Now, candles have been a part of Christian worship since the very beginning. We know that from the 20th chapter of the book of Acts. And it tells us that a group of Christians had gathered to have communion, and it said that there were many lights when that group of Christians gathered. And that would have been either oil lamps or candles. We don't know which. And we don't know much about how the earliest Christians did their services, but we do know when stuff started surviving more like in the 300s that they did use candles. Of course, using candles back then was the same thing as us using lights now. So we don't ever want to interpret candles as being anything magic, just like you don't want to interpret that light up there being magic. That just reminds us of the early Christians using candles that way. And the candles on the altar there or the reredos table are there to symbolize Jesus again as the light of the world. And that comes from a proclamation made in the year 1547 by the English King Edward VI. And he decreed that 2 candles would burn on the altar table. Remember, the Episcopal Church is the Anglican Church, the Church of England. Now, the use of candles has sometimes been controversial in Christianity. They are used in Catholic and Episcopal Orthodox services, and in many of the more formal Protestant churches. The more evangelical leaning Protestant churches usually don't use them, and of course contemporary churches don't use them. We have them in here because I've always been in churches that use them, and it just seems normal to have them. They're not in any way meant to convey any kind of magical power. Now, you'll notice this railing here, and like I said, these people would come up and kneel here to get communion on cushions. The area behind that railing is called the chancel. And that just simply means the space around the altar. When this church was a functioning Episcopal church, remember there would have been an altar up there, and the chancel is the area around the altar, and it is traditionally railed off from the rest. You'll notice that there is a step up here. This is also original to this church. Anything on top of this step here is the sanctuary. The sanctuary is where the service is conducted from. And when this was an Episcopal church, there would have been a pulpit on this side over here. There would have been what's called a lectern over here. The pulpit is always on the left, seated from the congregation. The lectern is on the right. It would have been here, and that is where preaching would occur, and the reading of Scripture would occur from the lectern. So everything up here is the sanctuary. Everything behind that railing is the chancel. And this part of the church is called the nave, N-A-V-E. That's where the congregation sits. Now, in the past, there were basically two different kinds of church design. One would be an arrangement like this, where you would have the altar, the pulpit, and the lectern. The other would be an arrangement to where you would have a pulpit in the middle. And you've probably been in churches that had the pulpit right in the middle. All right. That style of church with the pulpit in the middle developed within some Protestant churches. If you go to a Catholic, Orthodox, or Episcopal service, the center of that service, the most important part of that service, is seen to be communion. And that is why the table from where communion is done will be in the middle, because communion is seen to be most important. In Protestant churches, preaching was traditionally seen as more important, and that's why they would put the pulpit in the center. Now, today, you will often find Protestant churches that have the pulpit over to one side. I know one has it on the wrong side. It's on the right, it should be on the left. But you will traditionally, in Protestant churches, find the pulpit in the middle. Occasionally you'll find them on the side. And that's just a reflection of where, when people were deciding on the design of the church, they just thought that was the prettiest. And they just liked that design. So they put it that way. Now, today, of course, the design in churches is trending away from either one of the ones we talked about, and is moving more towards a design of a church that is like an auditorium with a stage. Again, that reflects the focus of the service. Remember, in this arrangement, as it used to be, with the altar in the center, that reflected that communion was the center of the service. In a Protestant church, such as at First Baptist or somewhere, with the pulpit in the center, that reflected that preaching was the center of the service. And now, in the churches that are like an auditorium with the stage, that reflects the fact that performances are the focus of the service. And indeed, they are. In contemporary churches, the focus of a contemporary church is performances. Now, there is an idea that the space in a church should significantly be different than any other space. You could have church anywhere. And you remember several years ago, one time when the heat broke in here, we had it over there in the funeral home. Now, the Bible does not give any directions for the building in which a church should be located in, and there's nothing magical about any of these kinds of church designs. They're just traditional, but there is a reason for making the interior of a church look different than any other space. We've talked in here before about how Jesus told us that we are not of this world. And we've talked in here before about how the very word church means to be called out of the world. As Christians, we are, in fact, called out of society and called out of the world. And coming to a church building and having the interior look so different than anything else reminds us of that. When we come in here, we do, in a very real sense, leave the world behind. It is different, and it's supposed to be. That's the reason the kind of music you will hear in here is not the same kind of music that you will hear in a bar or a restaurant or over the radio. It's different, and it's different on purpose. It reminds us of the fact that we are called out of the world. Now, this was made clear to me back a number of years ago during my travels in Germany. I used to go to a small town in southern Germany, and they had a church there. It was a Catholic church that was over 500 years old. And it was relatively small as far as Catholic churches go. It's a lot bigger than this, but it wasn't anything like a big cathedral or anything. And I used to like to go in there during the day and sit. The church was unlocked during the day, and you could just go in there. And I'd go in there and sit, and frankly, I would feel like I had been transported to some other place. And then if I sat in there for a while and then went back outside, it was like when I went back outside, I was entering into a different world. And that really impressed on me the reason for the design of churches like it is. It is supposed to remind us that we are called out of the world. Now, with that in mind, I'd like to switch gears for a little bit. I did this thing about these miscellaneous questions because people have asked me this, that, and the other over the years, and I thought, well, you know, it might be interesting to go through some of this stuff. I want us to think about some things to keep in mind for the new year. Now, we've just begun 2021, and I hope we will remember this year that as Christians, we are indeed called out of the world. That is true. Earlier in the book of Romans, when we heard, do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Earlier from our gospel reading, we heard where Jesus said that we're not of the world. 1 John 15 says, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Colossians 3 says, seek the things which are above where Christ is, sitting at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on things on earth. Couldn't be any clearer. So this year, let us remember that we are not of the world. We do not live by what the world says. We do not hold important what the world holds important. We do not strive for the things of the world. We are called to separate ourselves from the world. Now, I will admit that is something that is really, really hard to do. And yet it is emphasized so much in the New Testament that we really cannot afford to ignore it. We just can't ignore it. The other thing I hope we'll remember this year is that we need to act well toward other people. We heard in Ephesians earlier where it says, let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted and forgiving. We can't carry grudges. We've got to forgive others and act toward them the way we would have them act toward us. We have to act loving toward other people no matter how they act toward us. Remember, Jesus himself said, love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them that hate you. Pray for them who despitefully use you and persecute you. That does not mean, however, that you have to go along with them. It doesn't mean you have to be around them. And it certainly does not mean you have to let other people use you as a doormat. You see, the way the New Testament advises to deal with some of this stuff is to simply withdraw. Don't stay around and fuss and fight and bicker. And certainly don't compromise your principles just to get along with people. Simply withdraw yourself from the situation. We see that numerous times in the writings of Paul where he advises, withdraw yourself, have nothing to do with it, get out of it. Remember that we are called out of the world, and that does mean sometimes that we have to simply withdraw ourselves from some people and from some situations. We are not to hang around fussing and fighting and carrying on. Just pull back and withdraw. There's something else to keep in mind. Jesus did tell us to act well toward all people. He told us to love our enemies. But Jesus also told us to love ourselves. Remember what Jesus said, love your neighbor as you love yourself. You see, our love for ourselves should be equal to our love for others. There is nothing wrong with loving yourself. In fact, you should do it because Jesus told you to. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. Yes, that means love your neighbor, but it also means to love yourself. I know a lot of people who hate themselves. Really. Strive not to hate yourself. Love yourself. Now think about something that I have a problem with. I am a worryaholic. But Jesus expressly told us not to worry. I know how easy it is to worry about things. We can be overwhelmed with worry. And yet Jesus said, do not worry about tomorrow. Very plain. Do not worry about tomorrow. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. I struggle with that every day, but I do struggle with it. We have a little sign that Wanda got somewhere, and it says, enjoy today. And when you walk out our back door, and there's this little fence over here, she's got that sign hanging up there. I see that sign in the mornings a lot. And I see enjoy today. And I say, okay, if I spend the day worrying, how in the world am I going to enjoy today? Maybe you need to get a sign that says enjoy today or something like that. But, you know, those things are helpful as reminders to not let ourselves get dragged down. I hope we'll also remember this year that the way we live our lives is our Christian witness to the world. Our witness is not what we say. It's how we live our lives. Other people gain their idea of what it means to be a Christian when they look at the way we live our lives. And so we have to be careful about what kind of Christian witness the world sees. And I'm not talking about following moral rules. I'm not talking about whether you drink or go to the casino or stuff like that. It's the farthest thing from my mind. I'm talking about how you live your life, your whole life. Had a funeral yesterday. And the biggest part of that funeral was that the lady's grandchildren, she had 2 grandchildren, and her grandchildren had written their memories of their grandmother. And that was 90% of what I did at that funeral, was to read that. You see, they had gained this idea of the kind of person their grandmother was from the things they saw her do and what she did with and for them as they were growing up. You see, there was nothing in either one of their things that they wrote that said anything about what their granny had said to them. It was all about what their granny had done. And so our Christian witness is what we do. And I thought about that after we got home yesterday. I thought, okay, what would people write about me? The way I have lived my life. Not the things I've said. The way I've lived my life. What would they write about me? And again, I'm not talking about whether you drink and go to the casino or anything like that. That's the farthest thing. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus said, let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven.